Hello everyone, and welcome to the Midi MINATEC by Giant. Today we are very pleased to welcome Charles-Clemens Rüling, Senior Professor and Co-ordinator of the Chair for Public Trust in Health at Grenoble Ecole de Management. He's going to present his lecture on promoting institutionally misaligned innovations, the case of Openlabel placebos. He will talk about the difficulty that experts can have in adopting an invention. To understand this problem, he will use the example of placebos. Enjoy your conference.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm very happy to be with you here today. Thanks also for the possibility to speak in English. So I'm an economist and sociologist by training, and I've been working at Grenoble Ecole de Management for the last 20 years on different aspects of innovation. For the last 4 years, I've been coordinating a research chair, so an applied research initiative that looks specifically at innovation in the healthcare sector. So innovation in a very broad range. We have run projects where we look at the way in which connected implants affect the relationship between doctors and patients. We have studied e-health applications, and currently we are in one project where we study this strange thing, which I will talk today about, the open-label placebos. So it's always innovation, and then how this innovation gets adopted, accepted in the field, and how it changes relationships among actors. I wanted to start with one slide. Let me see whether I get this working. No, that's too far. Too far as well. So this one, understanding the non-adoption of innovations. I think when we look at innovation research, it's basically a field where we have 50 years of evidence. There are things that are relatively uncontested. So if we just try to map, let's say, high and low innovation efficiency, high and low innovation adoption, most of us would spontaneously expect that a very efficient innovation gets adopted, and inefficient innovation gets rejected. Now, where things become interesting are in the two quadrants where I have put the question marks. So it becomes interesting when we see that actually efficient innovations, so innovations that perform well technically, get rejected in a field, or when we have innovations that have low efficiency, so that don't provide a real advantage, get hugely adopted. These are the interesting questions where basically the pure technical or economic theorizing is not enough. And so the question I would like to address today, why are efficient innovations regularly rejected by informed experts? And now for these two fields, what really matters, and that's kind of my more sociological perspective, is of course the meaning that people attach to an innovation, like the question, how do they make sense of an innovation? Now, when we dig a little bit deeper on the sociological side, theoretically, we can go back to the late 1960s, a very famous body of theory proposed by two sociologists, Peter Berger and Thomas Luckmann, around the social construction of reality. And so what these authors try to argue and to show and to theorize is how social structures, how kind of the norms and standards that shape our everyday life emerge. And so what they argue is that we have processes like what they call habitualization. It's terrible jargon on there, but it's basically the fact that we do the same things over and over again, and we observe people doing the same things over and over again. Or legitimization, which means that we have actors that engage in theorizing, in systematizing knowledge, in explaining and justifying. Think, for example, about a religious text, or so that gets then declared holy, something like this. So we have processes of legitimization taking place, and a third important process, what they call sedimentation. So if this goes on over extended period of times, knowledge that was clearly related to a particular performance in the initial instances becomes sedimented and becomes taken for granted, which means we don't question anymore why we do certain things. We don't question anymore why we assign status or hierarchies or truth to some beliefs or to some behaviors and not others. So that's very important. We have in all domains today of research, the political world, and society at large, of course, what we call institutions. So bodies of taking for granted knowledge that are extremely difficult to question because they are believed to be true by the people who have been socialized into these institutions. So individuals learn about these rules and beliefs. Of course, primary socialization in your family background, secondary socialization through your education, and then further on throughout your professional trajectories. So we have rules, norms, and beliefs that are in most domains extremely solid and that cannot be easily be questioned. I show you some examples of innovations that failed to be widely adopted. The first one goes back to the late 19th century and then the 1930s, the famous controversy between the Scz and the Dvorak keyboards. That's probably a story you have already heard about when you've looked a little bit in the innovation literature. You probably all know where our QWERTY keyboard, or the AZERTY in French, comes from. The old story is when the typewriter was invented in the 1880s, basically one of the main problems mechanically was that these different levers that we have, I mean, that's already a relatively modern model, but that these levers could block each other when basically typists pushed on keys that were too close to each other. And so one of the big technical challenges in the invention of the typewriter was to spread out the letters so that these levers would not basically block each other like you would see it here. And this is the big invention, was patented, I think, around 1870, 1875 by somebody called Scholz, who is seen as the inventor of the modern typewriter. As the technology evolved, and the risk and the mechanics became better and the risk of blocking went down, quite a lot of people started thinking about this and came up with propositions of how to improve the layout of the keyboard. The most famous one is one proposed by an American professor of ergonomics by the name of Dvorak, who has, after quite a lot of research, come up with a new typewriter or keyboard layout, the Dvorak simplified keyboard that he published in the 1930s, together with a lot of research that actually showed or proved that this layout would increase typing speed by at least 40%. Why is this? Basically because all the important letters are in the middle row, and also because you have the vowels on the left side, the consonants on the right side, so it's a much more harmonic left-right typing experience and very much concentrated now for English in the middle row. Now, what happens, I mean, in the 1930s, this was highly publicized, but nobody decided to adopt it. None of the large typewriter producers, none of the large training organizations training typists at the time. And this has been a challenge for economists and others for a long time. And the standard explanation is, of course, that the classic QWERTY keyboard had become what we call a standard. So widely used that changing the standard would imply retraining quite a lot of people, changing quite a lot of material at the time. And then once you have, I mean, pools of typewriters of two different standards coexisting, also a lot of coordination cost. So you could say, technically inferior solution standards sometimes persist simply because the switching cost is too high. Now, I put this there as a controversy because there's more recent research that argues that actually when you reproduce the experiments that Dvorak had made in the 1930s, you don't actually find a huge advantage in performance. So there were some methodological issues around this, but I think for the original story, this doesn't matter because at the time, people had this information that this system was superior and it failed, so standards are important. So what are standards? Here they are formalized or informal social norms. The second example that's out of my own research a couple of years ago with a set of colleagues who work a lot on the cultural industries. We did a large study on innovation in the Australian wine industry. And I don't know whether you're interested in wine. This is a bottle of Penfolds Grange, the newest vintage, 2019. Penfolds Grange is today considered the most famous, probably also one of the most expensive Australian wines. So bottle of the latest vintage is sold by the estate itself for about 800 to 1,000 euros per bottle. Now, the story is interesting because when this wine was first created, really as an innovation, back in the 1950s by a very young and ambitious winemaker employed by one of the large wine companies in Australia, the original vintage of this wine was completely rejected. So that's a contemporaneous quote of the chief winemaker of this company, who was present at the very first tasting of this wine, and his comment apparently was, "This is a concoction of wild fruits and sundry berries with crushed ends predominating, which no one in their right mind will buy, let alone drink." Now, consequence, this young winemaker was forbidden to continue producing this wine. And then, of course, there's a whole backstory. He continued to produce some hidden vintages. Now, what happened there? So this is not so much about measurement and metrics. It's about taste. It's about taste and about people's ability to make sense out of something that tastes in a way that they don't expect and that they don't really know about. Now, in this story, what happens is that Max Schubert, the winemaker who's behind this wine, kind of frustrated, he gave away bottles to his friends. And little by little, people had these bottles, drank them, got a little bit used to this. And when you taste this for the third time or the fourth time or the fifth time, it's not so surprising anymore. And so, again, habitualization, people get to some extent used to this new taste. And in parallel, there was a complete overhaul or change of the evaluation system that was used by judges in the Australian wine shows, where suddenly wines that were produced like this, very heavy, very intense, with a lot of flavors, got an advantage. And so the company strategically decided to submit one of these very early wines to the wine show, and it immediately won a gold medal. And so you have, of course, the role of metrics in there. But here, it's very interesting how kind of collective taste forms and how something that people are not familiar with and they don't expect gets immediately rejected. Now, I have a first example that brings us a little bit closer to the healthcare field. From an article 2012, but that is interesting because it compares two innovations in cancer treatment. Now here, this is survival of advanced melanoma, one of the most dangerous and most difficult to treat types of cancers at the time, and I think still today. And what you see there is a comparison between two innovations at the time, so early immunotherapy and targeted therapy. And now what is very interesting in the debate of the authors, and in our chair we have also worked a little bit on immunotherapy in cancer, it's a real stake, how do you measure the effectiveness of a new treatment when it comes to something like cancer? And the traditional key measure that is regarded is the 1-year survival rate. So the question is, out of a cohort of patients, 100% alive at the beginning, how many are still alive after 1 year, after 2 years, after 3 years? But the core thing is the 1 year. And now what you find there is that when you compare the two on this 1-year benchmark, it's clear that the target therapy has a huge advantage. Because you see there's still 2/3 alive, whereas in the immunotherapy case, you have just about 40% that survive. It's still a little bit above about the benchmark treatment, but not so much. But now, when you look at the longer time frame, you actually see that in the targeted therapy, you have a strong effect at the beginning, but then you have quite a lot of relapse. Whereas in the immunotherapy case, there is only a relatively small portion of patients that react to this, but the probability that these patients get actually cured, and so that the line flattens out, is relatively high. Now, what I want to say here is that, of course, the metrics that we use to evaluate the performance or the efficiency of an innovation matters greatly. And in the case I have seen, I've had one discussion with somebody from a pharmaceutical company into a cancer immunotherapy, and they told me that for them it was a real challenge also to convince the health insurances and in France the AMM and so the official bodies that grant market access for drugs, to convince them to really consider the long-term effect of the drug and not just look at the 1 year or 2 year outcomes. Okay, now I come to our case, the famous open-label placebos. So it's, again, we can see this is an innovation in healthcare. It's not a different kind of drug, it's a different kind of practice. So what we're looking at is a very, very recent development. So we have publications, I would say, from 2015 onwards, where a group of highly prestigious actors associated with Harvard Medical School conduct research on placebos, but especially on what they call open-label placebos. That is the idea that you can improve patients' subjective symptoms in a range of pathologies through a non-deceptive placebo. So we normally assume that the placebo effect works if the patient doesn't know that it is a placebo. Typically, the control arm of a clinical trial, you have half of the patients that get the active component, half of the patients get the placebo, and normally you expect the placebo not to have an effect. Historically, some doctors or some medical practices involved giving placebos to patients, deceptive placebos to patients, even in clinical practice. This is clearly, according to today's ethical deontological standards, not an option anymore. It's considered highly unethical, making the patient believe that they get a drug if nothing is in there. This brought basically these researchers to explore the idea to what extent you can make the placebo itself ethical by disclosing it. Now, it's a very, very contradictory and quite controversial idea. And also here, I mean, we start our study from the evidence that has been published. And it's clear, I mean, we don't take a clear position with respect to this. So we don't say, take placebos, or we don't say this doesn't work. This is our starting point. It's an innovation that is out there, it's published, it's discussed. There are large conferences on the placebo effect on which open placebos are also discussed. Now, our question in there is, especially, I forgot this, that's the context, of course, this matters and is discussed a lot, especially in the US, of course, in the context of the opioid crisis. Because one of the domains where these open-label placebos seem to work is chronic pain. Now, the opiate crisis, we don't talk about this a lot in France, but in the US, it is a major problem, basically through prescription opioids that get abused and then growing dependency in the population. I just took the numbers this week from the Center of Disease Control. It is, you could say, very, very impressive, mind-blowing, very sad. More than 80,000 overdose deaths involving opioids in 2021. More than 640,000 people died in the period 1999 to 2021, and the overall economic burden estimated at $1.5 trillion. So that's almost the entire US defense budget, or 10 times the budget of all of education, primary, secondary, and university education in France. So this is a particular context that makes it relevant, even more relevant, especially in North America. Now, our question is basically what we want to understand is innovation in this healthcare field that we could characterize as a highly institutionalized field. I was talking before about the institutions, so these sets of taken for granted norms and rules that shape and guide and condition our behavior. Now, what we have in the healthcare field is very particular in terms that we have very high regulation, so very high regulation density. We have very strong social norms, also professional roles of what it is to be a doctor, how a nurse should behave, how caregivers should behave, how patients should behave, how a good healthcare system should function. So very strong norms. Also, who is kind of allowed to do what in terms of medical practice. healthcare is probably one of the fields, professional fields, that has been the most successful also in defining and keeping the boundaries around what the professional can do and what the non-professionals can do. We come back to this in a moment. When you look, for example, at the boundary between psychiatry and psychology, which is contested, but which holds, probably for good reasons. And we have a strong set, what we call here collective cognition, so shared language, shared beliefs across practitioners, of course, through training and so on. Now, our research question in this project is basically, how do physicians, so medical doctors, perceive the idea of prescribing open-label placebos? Because we say, if this is to work one day, it's not just enough to prove in a clinical trial that it works. We need also to think, what are the conditions that would facilitate the adoption of these drugs by healthcare practitioners? So the work I'm presenting here is conducted primarily by one of our doctoral students, Odile Hedler. So she engaged in all the data collection and analysis. And then we work together on the interpretation, of course. So what Odile has done, she has conducted, and this is a huge feat given how difficult it is to get doctors to talk about themselves, their practice, and devote time to social science researchers. So 56 in-depth qualitative research interviews with physicians in 3 different countries. So we focus here on physicians that are experts in the domain of chronic pain and that have more than 10 years of expertise. And as an inclusion criterion, of course, we only can work with physicians who have a basic willingness to discuss OLPs. So in this sense, you could say it's not a representative sample, but it is theoretically constructed. And we assume that the kind of barriers and issues that these doctors see might apply even more strongly to doctors that did not want to talk to us. So all the participants received information like articles, summaries about the OLP clinical trials. And during the interviews, and this is really a methodological idea brought in and developed by Odile, which I think worked very well, we used quite a lot of prompts, so visual prompts, textual prompts, to collect statements from these doctors where they really talk about themselves and how they see themselves as professionals and how they evaluate the legitimacy of these new drugs. So one example, we used this famous painting by Luke Fieldus, the doctor, so that is in London, in Tate, that for a lot of participants created a quite strong resonance and projection. So they said, yeah, I know this painting. I saw it as a medical student in my 2nd year, and I have thought about it ever since. So we have a lot of very personal relationships to this painting. I didn't know it before, but apparently among doctors, it is really highly iconic. And then we have all the interview transcripts, so a massive data set. We do inductive coding and then try to identify higher order topics. So the data analysis is still ongoing. Odile works on some very detailed and fine-grained analysis, but I just wanted to show you some insights on professional identity and on how they imagine these OLPs affect the relationship with their patients. So I put some of the verbatims in there. As we still have some time, I'll maybe read even some of them. So one is really that the idea of prescribing OLPs, even though they accept that the placebo effect itself works, and they would also say, of course, I use some kind of placebo effect in my medical practice, the way I talk to patients, the way I take their hand, the way I do my diagnostic activities. And so this is also part of a broader, you could say, contextual or placebo effect. But this idea of prescribing something and telling the patient that it is a placebo is problematic. And one of the tensions they see is really with their traditional expert role. So we have these quite violent statements where somebody said, so if you lead them down the path of the sugar pill, I can't, as a medical expert, I can't prescribe this. And so this is not arguing with the evidence from the clinical trials. It's very deeply held. My role as a doctor is to select the right active ingredients for my patient. And as an expert, I cannot do this. For the open-label placebo to work, the authority has to be completely transferred. It has to be completely transferred to the recipient. All I still could do as a physician is support. It means basically, if you really work with the patient on the placebo effect, it means that the patient triggers some self-healing abilities in his mind. And this doesn't really fit the traditional role of the doctor. Well, I'm not sure that I could talk openly and transparently about placebo and be able to answer questions. I would have a hard time. Now, the second is basically the second point that we find that is interesting is that there's a problem with the placebo category itself. So the word placebo. Because for the doctors, the term placebo is very intimately related to the world of clinical research and the clinical trials and deception. And so this idea of open-label placebos simply doesn't work, doesn't make sense for them. So where it says, as soon as you say, I'm giving you a placebo, I don't think it works. I have a bias against this. I believe it. I don't believe it. I don't. It's ethically better, understand that, but is it physiologically better? Or I don't believe it's ethical to give a placebo outside of a study. So there we see that there is actually an issue with the term itself, and again, habit and the meaning that is attached to the concept itself. So the placebo, not the open-label placebo. And we find a third dimension in there where doctors very explicitly talk about their fear, you could say, of negative judgments by their peers. So, for example, I think the biggest barriers would be the concern about the ethical nature and the importance of disclosing, and my ability to convince my colleagues. So, of course, adopters, especially if they are expert professionals, they are not alone. They think at how this might be perceived, how this might be valued within the social field they are part of. Then how do we actually document it in the chart? So where they note everything that they have given a patient. Right, because again, if something goes wrong, even a placebo treatment may not be harmless. Of course, we also have nocebo effects, and even though a placebo doesn't have any active ingredient, patients might still feel a side effect. So what happens if somebody's lawyer looks at, oh my God, you gave this patient a placebo, and now this placebo is giving patients more pain. So it's this very tricky thing where doctors, physicians, on one hand, recognize that the disclosure is interesting from an ethical point of view, but they also say it exposes me to quite a lot of risk with respect to my peers, with respect to, let's say, the legal environment, if I do this openly. And so there are other practices doctors tell us about that they call kind of dirty placebos, where they would prescribe a real drug, but in a dosage that is so small that it cannot have an effect. So doctors are using this, but the disclosure part really is at odds with their professional identity. And the second part concerns the relationship they have locally with their patient. So one interrogation is about, let's say, their peers, their field, their professional identity, the norms and standards in their medical occupation. The second issue concerns really the interaction they have with individual patients. And so on one hand, we see that OLPs, they imagine OLPs will work if they have a very strong, trusting relationship with the patient. So part of why placebo can work is because we are suggesting that it works and there's trust between the physician and the patient. Well, they would need to be somewhat educated in the issue so that they would accept that you are offering them a sugar pill, and it's not because you think that they are a weak person and that the problem is in their head, that you are doing it because it might actually work and that you care about them. And that's why you are giving them the option of taking this. So a lot of reflection on what does it mean, what does it signal to a patient when the doctor says, you know, for your chronic pain, I can propose you something, but there is no active ingredient in it. It might work, it might not work, but why not try it? You don't want patients to feel that it's in their head. You will give me this placebo treatment because you think my pain is not real. So there is really something at stake. Again, the relationship between the doctor and the patient, the reality of the suffering of the patient, and if you want to see, say, the value of the treatment that the doctor proposes. On the side, we have run a quantitative study with a large panel of citizens here of the Grenoble area on how they would perceive OLPs. And not so surprising, because we have similar results in other studies conducted in the UK and in the US on the same topic. Most patients would agree that the placebo effect works, but they would largely prefer, so around 70% of respondents would prefer that their doctor doesn't tell them. Which is surprising because, again, it goes against this idea of healthcare democracy and co-decision making between doctors and patients. Okay, the last point, here very clear comments also about, okay, on one hand, we need the trust, but kind of providing or proposing a placebo at the same time risks undermining this very trust. So just two examples here. So you're talking about embracing the placebo effect in some way and sharing with the patients that there's nothing in this. That's the problem. Doctor, you're telling me there's nothing in there. Yeah. How do they deal with that? You know, there's nothing in there. I mean, you have to have a good response. Or I can hear just somebody say or write online in a review of the doctor, she did not give me time today. She just wanted to give me a sugar pill. She's terrible. Don't go to her. Also, patients insist on really being part of the discussion, so you have to have some information to show them. So basically, the risk that the doctor, him or herself, might get very fundamentally questioned in their willingness, actually, to meaningfully engage with the patient through this OLP prescription. Okay, so these are just two aspects that I wanted to show today out of this study. So what is interesting now from a more theoretical perspective is that we really have two levels of legitimacy judgment. So in the literature, these are called the validity. So validity would be somebody's perception of how an innovation is evaluated on the level of an entire field. So the peers, the standards, the norms, the medical societies, and so on. And another level, which is the appropriateness. So one person individually, with respect to their local social interactions, is it the right thing to do? And of course, things become then interesting if you have a tension between the two. If, for example, a certain practice is ruled out or considered illegitimate, let's say on the collective level, but somebody still thinks that individually it is the right thing to do, or the other way around, if things are enabled or supported collectively, but people, for any reason, think, no, this is not what I should do individually. And so these tensions might be interesting to observe in the years to come as these drugs will maybe one day come to the market. And behind, in this case, is really this underlying tension between two different logics. And you find, when you dig a little bit into medical history, you find this tension basically already in ancient Greece. So it's really the question, is the doctor a scientist or is the doctor a healer, if we put it really on the extreme sides? And medicine has always had parts of both. Of course, it is a therapeutic encounter between a doctor and a patient, but the doctor's intervention should be evidence-based. So we have this very strong norm of evidence-based medicine since the 1970s, and the importance of clinical trials to make sure that patients get the right treatment for them. But at the same time, we still have this layer of basically the healing interaction. And somehow the OLP brings this old debate about what is the role of the doctor, what's the role of the relationship, again, to the fore. So to conclude, just 4 points summarizing what I can say, okay, what we need to be careful about when we try to promote institutionally misaligned innovations. First of all, always keep in mind innovations are not adopted on the basis of their technological efficiency alone. It depends on their legitimacy. Now, it seems very straightforward, very basic, but I can tell you I've worked in several projects in medical devices, and normally what people would say, oh, performance and ease of use. But we have to dig a little bit deeper and really try to understand how the users construct their legitimacy judgments around a device, a technology, a practice. So innovators need to understand how actors judge the legitimacy of their innovation, and they need to address the potential legitimacy issues. And as I just said, so we have these two levels that we can separate. I mean, it's a very simple model, but I think it's quite powerful. So on the collective level, so these general norms and standards, and really with respect to somebody's direct social environment. So this question of validity and appropriateness. And now in the healthcare part, especially when we work with physicians, I think professional identity, then this notion of the categories and meanings. So am I still a physician when I do this? Categories and meanings, this is for clinical research, but not for practice. And the third aspect I think that matters is very much these social interactions. So how can I respond to my patients? Okay, so this was a little bit a short glimpse on our project. So I would like to thank Odile Hedler for all the research she has done, of course, all the participants in our study, and of course you for having come here despite the rain. I see there's a little bit of sun now outside, so it was maybe worthwhile. Yeah, I'm open for your questions, and again, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your conference. You can now ask your question by raising your hands, and we'll give you the microphone. So if you have questions.
Well, concerning the placebos, is the study that compare the effect of the placebo with two groups of patients, one in telling them it is a placebo and the other, of course, not? Just to...
Yeah. There's a huge problem in running valid clinical trials on open-label placebos. So what they do is actually they have two groups that get the placebo drug, and one is told that it's a placebo. And the others believe just that they participate in a trial that tries to measure the effect of an innovative treatment.
And is there a clear difference?
Yeah, there's a second debate brought up by some of the doctors, of course. We see a statistically significant difference, but then some of our respondents said, looking at the papers, these are pain scales. It's subjectively reported pain, normally on a scale from 0 to 10. And even though you might see a statistic difference, the question is then always the size of the effect. So even if it's statistically significant, you see that, okay, the pain goes down, or there's between 6.8 and 6.0 on a 10-point pain scale. Is it meaningful? So we have this. But there's clearly a methodological issue really in establishing the effectiveness of
So
OLPs.
you are contradicting the classical vision of placebo is effective because the patient do not know it's a placebo.
But you could say at least the fact that patients do know doesn't take away the placebo effect. This is something that you can clearly show. And of course, what we need to say very clearly, I'm not at all arguing that we should give placebos for infections or kind of illnesses. What we see is that it seems to work in some pathologies where we have subjective symptoms, especially chronic pain. And it's not just a psychological effect. And a lot of the research today in neuroscience on the placebo effect looks basically on the processes happening in the brain when the patient receives a placebo. So we have the two things. On one hand, a lot of research, but again, that's not our field, to understand the placebo effect per se. And then basically the research that tries to figure out, can we use it in a non-deceptive way in clinical practice? But again, on a very limited set of pathologies, and of course, always based on a medical diagnosis and by a medical practitioner, by a clinician. I think that's important. So the idea is not, and that's one of the big debates also in this community, is not to open the doors for charlatans, healers, and so on, but the idea is really, could this be an alternative in the kind of toolbox of the experienced pain specialist?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Do you think we can resolve the case of Openlabel's placebo as the case of the Australian wines? Because if the old doctor says that it can work, there is a kind of legitimacy, and maybe the relationship and it's not that important.
I think so. Typically, and that's very interesting when you look. That's again my view of the strategy behind the group of medical researchers that tries to advance this agenda. They don't at all try to position it as an alternative treatment. They try to prove that it works, going through the clinical trials, trying to go to the main medical journals, creating an academic society that does more research on this, with the ultimate aim, I don't know where they are currently, but that's what I heard at one point in time, that they also consider basically getting FDA approval for a placebo. So basically, I think that's very interesting in the underlying institutional work going through the mainstream. And maybe also do some we call this institutional entrepreneurship or institutional work behind to enhance the acceptability of these drugs. Now, when we said in the wine case, people got used to the wine by drinking it from time to time and they weren't surprised anymore. I mean, when you really want to change practices in a field like medicine, I think it is on the level of medical training. It's on the level of treatment protocols and all this, that things need to change slowly. And then, like we see in all fields, as soon as you have high status actors kind of visibly embracing it, this also helps diffusion, of course.
Okay, thank you. Do you have questions, maybe? No? Okay, thank you for attending this conference. We look forward to seeing you at the next MINATEC by Giant on Friday, November 17, with a talk by Pascal Fender, Senior Research Director, Team Leader at the Grenoble Institute of Structural Biology, and Lyon Biopol experts. The theme of his talk is mimicking viruses to better fight them. He will talk about virus-like particles that could train our immune systems to prevent infection. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.